I'm Nina Boski.
And I'm Gary Vitacco Robles.
And this is the American Icon Facebook page, and we are talking about Mental Health Awareness Month in honor of Marilyn. So the last couple of weeks we've been talking about Marilyn and her family legacy and how that may be a contributor to her mental health issues as well as addiction, but also yourself if you're going through it or a loved one. And then last week we got into some pretty serious discussions around sexual and physical abuse and childhood trauma, not only as it relates to Marilyn, which was Gary. I mean, that was a challenging conversation to see it so laid out like we laid it out for the audience, but also for you, the viewer, that may be dealing with sexual or physical abuse or childhood trauma from your past, which hopefully you can get some resources and some information that we provided, and know that you're not alone. There are a lot of people that have been dealing with a lot of childhood past traumas, and I think this is why we labeled it the tag where healing meets life. This is your opportunity, as we're bringing awareness to mental health awareness issues around mental illness and addiction, that we can start to take the stigma away from it. So this is really, really powerful. And for those of you who may be just tuning in for the first time, Gary Vitacco Robles and myself, Gary is one of the most acclaimed best-selling authors of Icon. Now I've got both books in my hands, and I was just telling him right before we started, I feel like I can go work out with these. Look at the thickness of these, right? Look at that. And volume 2 is actually thicker, Gary, than volume 1. It's heavier.
It's still a good bicep curl.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. There we go. So that's fun. But it's Icon, the lifetimes and films of Marilyn Monroe. And we will be looking into Marilyn's life from both of these volumes and really listening and hearing from her, not just what we think. So if we're giving you our opinion, you'll know it. And if we're giving you what she said, then you hear exactly from what she said. And I know for the Marilyn experts, along with myself, it is a real honor to have somebody love Marilyn and have such a tribute to her and care so much. So for those of you who may be just tuning in for the first time, this is a great, great source. So I'm also going to suggest that you go out and buy it if you really want to know what happened to Marilyn Monroe, the best that we know so far. Almost 57 years later, right, Gary? Is it? I cannot believe it. And her birthday is coming up in just a couple of weeks, right? So Gary, what were your thoughts about last week's Vodcast? And Vodcast, for some people ask, what's a Vodcast? It's a video podcast. So basically, it's a video portion of a typical podcast. We just put video towards it. So people have asked that question.
So to truly understand Marilyn, you really have to understand her within the lens and the context of her surviving complex childhood trauma, which we outlined last week. And that is multiple episodes of trauma. She experienced neglect, she experienced poor attachments in early childhood, sexual abuse by multiple offenders over a long course of time, physical abuse as well, multiple placements. And all of those converge together to create disruptions in normal and natural development. And this all occurred while the young brain is developing. And nowadays we know so much about brain development and how these early childhood traumas begin to rewire the structure of our brains. And it rewires the areas where our impulse control comes from and where our emotional regulation capacities come from. And so when a child doesn't have the stability of a consistent caregiver who could meet their needs and create a safe, loving environment, there are some real serious, devastating consequences which that person can experience over the course of their lifetime. And so we broke down Marilyn's trauma, which was really heavy to address, and just to return to humanize. This is the face of the little girl when she was first sexually abused. And in the course of the last week, I even found her kindergarten picture. And you can see she is the second one in, and she's not looking very happy. So you can see her expression here in a close-up. So that face pretty much symbolizes and represents what she was going through at the time. So I think this week is a good follow-up as we talk about BPD, or borderline personality disorder, which is kind of misunderstood still to this day, probably because the name borderline doesn't really capture what it is. That word kind of, we'll talk about it later, but it goes back probably 80 years to when the symptom clusters were first identified. And you know, my editorial on it is that, you know, that classification, that term really needs to be changed to capture what it really is. But it stemmed from this early childhood trauma. So people with borderline personality disorder, you know, about 86% of them report that they were sexually abused as children. About 73% of them report physical abuse. Maybe 75 roughly disclose emotional neglect and abuse. So, you know, it's going on during that time of the brain when these areas are developing, and it kind of derails natural development, and it kind of sets the person up. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What is BPD?
So, Gary, one of the things I want to talk to you about is there's a lot of confusion around borderline personality disorder, which people get very much confused with bipolar, which we're going to be talking about next week. So what can one do to understand exactly what it is? Because I have to tell you, I'm in the transformational space, and I hear these terms you know, thrown around almost like, oh, they've got borderline personality disorder, or they got bipolar. And sometimes it's confusing when I look at the definition, and I'd like you to really give the definition today for borderline personality. So if you know somebody that may be dealing with it, yourself may be dealing with it, what exactly it is, and how is it different than bipolar disorder? Because I think a lot of times people get those two personality, you know, health issues, mental health issues, very much confused.
Well, borderline personality disorder is one of 10 personality disorders, and this particular disorder, it's a disorder of instability and impulsivity. So there's instability in relationships, in moods, in behavior, and this sense of self. And so what's underlying through all of this is that the person with BPD has this chronic fear of abandonment. And this is abandonment which might be real or that they perceive. So it's kind of like an insecurity in relationships. So this person would always be kind of preparing for some loved one to abandon them. And they're triggered by little behaviors which might be an indication to them that they are being abandoned, where in reality it isn't. But this constant expectation of being abandoned often drives the loved one away to distance themselves because it's so overwhelming. And this fear of abandonment almost takes on like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and ultimately might lead to an abandonment which otherwise might not be there. So, you know, their reactivity is really strong. And folks with BPD, they don't have a strong sense of themselves. And they can't, they need kind of like external validation for themselves. So you or I, Nina, we don't have this disorder. So we have a basic idea of who we are, and we feel strongly about that. And there might be stressors in life which come up. There might even be relationships that end. But our whole identity isn't a part of that. We can kind of navigate through that. It might be very distressing. It might be, you know, emotionally devastating and overwhelming, but we still have a sense of who we are, and we can provide that for ourselves. Someone would. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you a question. This is interesting, and I want to get real here around this, because I don't also want people to get confused if they might have an abandonment issue. So I'm going to use myself as an example. Growing up without a dad, I think that in my younger years, particularly, but probably throughout my young adult life, that fear of abandonment was there and very prevalent. Now I've been able to work through it, and I don't have some of the other, you know, just like I wasn't promiscuous or dangerous behaviors. How does that distinguish between somebody who might have an abandonment issue, because that seems to be the fueling cause?
Well, it's very extreme. You know, we all have, if you look at the criteria, and we're going to go through all of the criteria for borderline personality disorder, and we can all see ourselves, I think, in some of the symptoms, but to truly have the diagnosis, it has to be pretty pervasive, you know, and impacting all our relationships, our occupation. It's across a variety of contexts. It really impacts the life in every way imaginable.
So let's give an example of a potential person that might have, not bipolar, but see, I'm already doing it, borderline personality disorder.
Part of the confusion might also be that borderline personality disorder often co-occurs with other disorders. And there, you know, I treat a large population of folks who have both borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. And the combination of those two disorders, very difficult to treat, and the work is very long term. So if you kind of take all of this and put this together, if you have trauma, the trauma could lead to the personality disorder, but the trauma could also lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, which we talked about last week. So those disorders very often kind of run together. There could be an underlying mood disorder, depressive disorder, or bipolar disorder going on. Now you've got a cluster of those three things. So it's hard to sometimes tease out what's going on. But to simplify something very complex, which is bipolar disorder, that is a disorder where there's episodes of major depression. So those are, you know, serious depression where someone doesn't have any energy. Someone doesn't have pleasure in life. They might sleep too much. They have thoughts about death. They think about suicide. So they have these episodes going on while they also have, you know, other episodes in which there's an elevated expanse of mood and a burst of energy, and they have very pressured speech, and they have goal-directed activities, and they have a lot of impulsivity, and they might be engaging in risk-taking behavior. And some of that we're going to hear is also going on with borderline personality disorder. But you've got the extreme of the depression, and you've got well, now we're talking about just the bipolar. See how? Okay. So you've got those, you know, two episodes, but you can also have a depressive episode going on with a mania as a mixed episode, and but these are usually treated by mood stabilizing drugs. So it's not coming out of necessarily childhood trauma.
Okay, so let me ask you another question, because this is confusing. So if it's confusing to me, who gets a lot of this stuff, right? And I've always had it in my head, and this is probably wrong, and you're going to go, Nina, this is so wrong. When I look at somebody and they've got a very extreme mood change, I always look at bipolar with more of, they go through a mania and then they might crash and they go down to kind of low energy, no energy, or very dark side of themselves. Okay, so there's this swing, but the swing kind of goes like this. Okay, borderline personality disorder, how I have viewed it is, let's say I call somebody up and in 10 minutes from now, and they are nice as anything, and then 5 minutes goes by and they call me back and they're screaming at the top of their lungs, really for no reason. So the extreme change in mood happens like that, like 60 seconds versus 6 hours, etc. Is that appropriate in terms of distinctions, or am I just making that up in my head?
Sometimes, but maybe not all times, because there could be rapid cycling bipolar disorder.
Do you see how confusing this is?
Yeah, it is, and this is what creates a diagnostic challenge and a challenge for treatment. And this is probably why Marilyn's fate is what happened to her, because oftentimes these disorders are misdiagnosed. And even in the best of times now to treat them, it's probably best now more than ever before. But this is where you really need a diagnosis to be made by a mental health professional, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a licensed practitioner who will really dig deep and follow the criteria. So, borderline personality disorder is also marked by the threats of suicide or suicide attempts. And this is a little bit different than what we find in bipolar disorder with suicide attempts. So it also plays into the fear of abandonment. So sometimes the motivation behind this is, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. Or I'm going to take pills and I'm going to call you and tell you I'm taking the pills because I need you in my life. And my belief is if I threaten to harm myself, you will come and rescue me and you'll be there for me and you won't leave me. There's also a sense of such emotional pain of someone experiencing a borderline personality disorder that sometimes they just want to die in the moment. It's just to end the emotional pain that they're feeling in this instant. Whereas in bipolar disorder, it's something different at play. It doesn't have these interpersonal themes. It's not linked to relationships. It's not linked to fear of abandonment. It isn't a cry for help. Another feature of borderline personality disorder is that under stress, the person can appear really paranoid, almost like believing that there's like some conspiracy against them. And that can be confused with true psychosis, like with schizophrenia, which has delusions associated with that diagnosis. This isn't really a psychotic episode. This isn't really a delusion. It's just when the person's really, really stressed out, they begin to appear very paranoid. And this is probably where the term borderline developed in the late 30s, was that folks appeared kind of between the truly the severe psychotic disorders and the disorders that were more what they call back then neurosis. We don't even use that term anymore. That comes more out of anxiety. So they sometimes appeared to be, psychotic when they really weren't. So it would be helpful for us to go down the criteria for the disorder.
Okay. So let me just back up the truck here.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm listening to this and I have a loved one that I'm hearing you talk about, or myself, and I'm feeling that I might have some of these symptoms, let's just say, there's a part of me that's saying, oh my gosh, I have got the biggest fear out there. I don't want to deal with any of this because look what you're telling me, that, I've got suicidal thoughts, I've got abandonment issues, I've got all these things that are very bringing up that kind of sense of anxiety and fear from the onstart. So how in the world is somebody like me, if that's the case, if I'm feeling this either about a loved one or myself, going to reach out and get help? No wonder there's been such a hidden kind of stigma behind this, because it's hard to talk about.
And for the people who love folks with borderline personality disorder, it's very, very challenging, because they might feel that somehow they are failing the person, or they can't, emotionally provide for them. So life becomes very unpredictable. At one moment they value me, at one moment they devalue me, which is another symptom of the disorder. So sometimes you need validation. Well, is the sky blue? I thought the sky was blue. Maybe the sky isn't blue, because always living in this chaotic roller coaster type of an environment. And so it's not about being a bad person. It's not anything like this. It's a true disorder that has treatments available. And nowadays, we have something called dialectical behavior therapy, which is very, very successful for people with borderline personality disorders. It's a longer term work. And it's important that it takes place within the context of a trusted relationship with a therapist. And you can imagine, since the disorder involves paranoia and inability to trust and fear of abandonment, even developing a relationship with a therapist can be kind of anxiety provoking. But to develop that relationship and be able to do that work can result in major life changes and a better quality of life. And it can stabilize relationships, not just love relationships, but family relationships, because we're talking about all kinds: mother, daughter, husband, wife, partners, work relationships as well, even friendships. So the disorder is pervasive and impacts all relationships, not just our romantic ones.
Well, I know for myself, and I wouldn't want to even attempt to think that I could, diagnose some people that I know in my old working life in media. But I would tend to think that some of the people I know might have a little bit of this disorder, and
We probably all do. We probably all do know someone, or we know folks, and might even be ourselves, who have many of the traits, but it might not rise to the level to meet the criteria for the full diagnosis. But having some of the traits can still make life pretty challenging. So you don't have to meet the diagnostic criteria to get treatment for the symptoms that you're experiencing. If you're having any kind of a struggle with relationships where you're conflicted about your own sense of identity, there are treatments and supports there and available to help us navigate through those things as well, without having the severity of some of these disorders.
So let me ask you, Gary, in regards to Marilyn, was she diagnosed at the time? I don't believe she was with all of the disorders. It was only bipolar that she was diagnosed with. It wasn't borderline personality, or did they even have it back then?
Well, they actually did. Back in the 30s, they had it, and people were identifying these symptoms and they were treating it. Now, well, let me go back to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is where the criteria for the disorders are recorded. And so in Marilyn's day, they were working on the DSM from 1952. And so it was very Freudian based. It wasn't based on current research and what we know about evidence-based practices and brain research. It was based upon Freudian theories. And so it was very, very limited back then. But folks with borderline personality issues were presenting themselves to therapists, to psychoanalysts at the time. And so it is in the literature. And it takes a long time for these disorders to be kind of voted upon by committees before they make it into the manual. So it wasn't until 1980 that it actually became a bona fide diagnosis, but we knew about it long before. And Dr. Ralph Greenson, her very last psychiatrist, was the one who was documenting many of the symptoms that you would recognize as borderline personality disorder in correspondence with his colleagues. He was writing to Dr. Marianne Criss, who had treated Marilyn, about his challenges in treating her in Los Angeles. He was writing to Anna Freud, and all of his letters have made it into the researchers' hands and into the biographers' hands, such as myself, and they're stored at the University of California. They're sealed until Los Angeles. I'm sorry, and they're sealed now until 2039. And so, he talks about her symptoms, and he was treating them, but he would, unfortunately, some of his treatment techniques were the opposite of what someone with borderline personality disorder needs. So the need to help her with the stress tolerance, with coping skills, to establish very clear boundaries with the patient. And what was he doing? He wasn't really helping her become autonomous. He was inadvertently fostering a dependence upon him. He invited her into his home with his wife and his adult children. She attended social events with them. She spent the night at the house. These would not be appropriate techniques. These would be things that kind of fuel some of her symptoms. And then he would become, he talked about becoming a little resentful of her dependency upon him, which he created. And then he would want to pull away and go on vacation with his family and do other things, and she would go into a borderline crisis. And when he went with his wife to Europe and Israel during the spring of 1962, while Marilyn was on the set of Something's Got to Give, he saw her practically every day for treatment, and then he goes away, and she over-medicates, and her children are coming to the home and finding her overdosed and in bed, unable to get up and go to work, saying that she was worthless, unlovable, and here we have a crisis. So, unfortunately, many of her symptoms of BPD were exacerbated by the treatments that were at hand and by the specific treatments, unfortunately, of Dr. Greenson. His daughter, Joan Greenson, has an unpublished memoir in which she identifies many of the symptoms of borderline personality disorders in Marilyn as well. And she, was honest with herself and her readers about some of the shortcomings of her dad.
Well, also, Gary, I think part of it was the time, right? They were doing things that today would not even be even remotely acceptable. However, do you think that also Greenson, I'm sure there's a part of him that, and this is my opinion here, so this isn't fact, this is just a story I tell myself, right? Is that on one hand, I think he really did want to help her.
Absolutely.
The flip side of it is, I think there's another part of him that fed into that ego, which is, I am the doctor and I'm going to save you. I'm going to do all these things. And then his resentment of it could have been really, really challenging. So both could have been going on, and we'll never know for sure. But I think that what you're saying, the fact that he was feeling resentful, he almost created a monster, and the monster that he created, he was resentful for, but he had created it himself. So let's say somebody is in relationship with somebody that is a borderline or has a borderline personality disorder. Let's start with love for just a moment, and then it could transfer over to today we're recording on Mother's Day, so I'm sure that we know somebody, whether it's a coworker, a family member, a loved one. But I find that sometimes the more romantic relationships, because they can bring up such huge traumatic fears in people. How would you, or what would you say to somebody that is dealing with it themselves? That's the first part of the question. And then if you are in a relationship with somebody with borderline personality disorder, how do you manage that?
Well, we have the ability now to, on the internet and through literature, we can find books to read about the disorder. So it would be important. Marsha Linehan is actually a wonderful researcher and writer about borderline personality disorder, and she writes in a way that it's easy for all of us to understand. It's not a lot of the technical jargon. And
can you say her name one more time?
Marsha Linehan.
Okay. And did she have a book out? Does she have a book out too?
There's multiple books.
Multiple books out. Okay.
She has published probably since the 80s exclusively about borderline personality disorder and dialectical behavior therapy, which is the prescribed state-of-the-art treatment at this time. So that would be a place to begin, but it's important that we don't self-diagnose. So seeking out a professional would be a very important thing to do. There are support groups in communities for folks that are challenged by mental illness in their lives or the lives of someone that they love. And it would be appropriate to seek out a mental health therapist to kind of discuss with them your concerns about your relationship, because it's, you don't even need the other person present to begin that exploration about what's going on. And then that can easily move into a family session in which the person you're concerned about can hear some of your concerns in a way that is navigated with the support of a professional, so that that person doesn't feel ambushed or ganged up upon. So, it's important to consult with a professional about your challenges in dealing with these types of behaviors and symptoms in your relationships.
Well, I thank you for that. And I think that people listening to this or watching this are going to be, quite moved by some of the things that you've talked about. What are some of the risk factors? We talked a little bit about what it is and what to do about it, but what are some of the risk factors?
Well, certainly adverse childhood experiences. We know more and more about this today. In our early childhood, when we're having serious issues, losses, traumas, not necessarily to the extent of traumas, but just negative events, and the complexity of multiple experiences like that, they increase our risk for any mental health disorder, including personality disorders, addiction, and physical health issues. So BPD really goes hand in hand with trauma. And some of the symptoms that the criteria for the symptoms is someone who's frantically trying to avoid a real or an imagined abandonment, someone who has a pattern of unstable relationships. And when I say unstable pattern, this could be multiple relationships. These can just be tumultuous relationships. So, they might join with someone very quickly after a short period of time in a very, very passionate way, and then become very angry in that relationship and very tearful in that relationship. And there might be a lot of conflict, and then it switches to a passion once again. It's that whole sense of like a roller coaster. Relationships aren't supposed to be so traumatic themselves. So that kind of a swing between the passion and the intensity and the negative emotions and the anger, that could be and certainly an indication of an unstable relationship. And there's also this sense of having extreme value of a relationship and then devalue. And let me try to break that one down. So think about like when a baby is lying in a crib and really needs comfort and is crying for the mother or the caregiver, whoever that might be, and the caregiver doesn't come. And so that little baby is having kind of a concept of kind of bad caregiver. But then the caregiver comes, and now the baby is comforted. So now that's good caregiver. And so if we're growing up in a healthy, loving, stable environment, we begin to get a sense to integrate that our caregivers are made up of positive and negative factors. Not everybody is all good, not everybody is all bad because they can't meet our needs, but we can tolerate and accept that there's good and bad in a person or in a relationship. But when the baby is growing up in an environment of trauma, they don't have that balance, or the person who sometimes loves them might be the person who sometimes is abusing them. So this really impacts our ability to navigate through healthy relationships later in life. And so in borderline personality disorder, there's this sense that, oh, this person is going to be my savior. They're my everything. I would die without them. But then somehow when that person doesn't meet their need, or that person might need to go off and do some other things, the person with BPD can't tolerate that. And now that person might be demonized. So if you're on the receiving end of that, you never know where you stand. You're valued one moment, you're the devil the next moment. And that kind of makes it extremely challenging to be in relationships and be able to tolerate the positive and negative flows that are a part of even the healthiest of relationships.
So let's just say right now, I just listened to that, and I'm finding in myself that I have that pattern. I will be so loving one moment and then turn around and maybe be screaming at the top of my lungs. That's a very scary thing to have to start to examine in oneself. And I think what I heard you say was the first thing you should do is find a qualified, I have to say qualified, accredited psychotherapist in this area that can actually help you work on multiple levels. I'm a firm believer, and Gary, I think you would feel the same way. Drugs are not the end all, and neither is just cognitive behavior therapy or whatever the other diagnosis that you had talked about. I look at the person as holistic, right? There's multiple ways to start approaching something like this. But what would you say to that person that may be listening for the first time and going, you know what, I'm going to take a breath. And this would be my suggestion to the person, is take a breath and realize that you're not alone, and that we all have stuff, and we're all human, and I might have a broken arm, or I might have diabetes, or I might have an issue with my lungs. I might have a broken leg, whatever it is. We all have something that we're dealing with. And I'm always a firm believer that what you don't acknowledge, you can't heal. And so keeping it hidden or keeping it secret, what you resist persists. So what would you say to somebody, given the fact that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks that you are, in addition to a very credited Marilyn Monroe biographer, what a great profession to be in, but you are a mental health professional as well. And I just want to make sure that people watching you know that you're not just a biographer of Marilyn, but you've been in the industry for 25 years.
Well, labels are for bottles and not for people. And sometimes we get really freaked out by the label, and there's stigma with labels, and there's judgment in our culture with labels, and all that has to end. So when someone might be facing the fact that, oh, maybe I have this, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It's no different than if you had diabetes, or if you had hypertension, or if you had a broken femur. It's just terminology that helps us understand what the issue is, so that we could begin to fix things, and so it's to help and to heal. And so it's not really about the label. We all deserve to have a quality of life. We all deserve to reach our potential. And if we have any choices or behaviors or symptoms going on in our lives that prevent us from being all that we want to be, all that we need to be, there are people out there who are qualified to help us. There are treatments out there that are available to help us achieve what we want to achieve as close as we can get to it. And so why deny ourselves the potential to take advantage of that technology? And in a safe relationship with a therapist, there isn't going to be judgment. It's a safe place to explore these issues, and the therapist will pace the progress based upon what the person sets their goals to be. So, it really involves having to find just the right person to work with, and that might be trial and error, but begin with that relationship. And oftentimes the work is done within the context of that safe relationship with a healthy person. And for folks who've been dealing with some of these disorders and have had disruptive and unstable relationships, it could be hard to imagine. It could be hard to surrender a little control to begin to trust someone. And so that becomes part of the challenge. But in these therapeutic relationships, this beautiful work can be accomplished.
So let's talk a little bit, bring back what we initially started talking about, which was Marilyn and her history as well for Mental Health Awareness Month. What would you say, given your professional opinion, right? Obviously you weren't treating her at the time, but everything that you know of Marilyn, what would she have been diagnosed with?
I think there's a lot of reliability by mental health professionals who hear her story to see the borderline personality disorder. That seems to be very, very clear. And coming out of her childhood history of complex trauma, it isn't a surprise. Clearly, I think she experienced post-traumatic stress at various points in her life, and that again goes hand in hand with having survived complex trauma. So those two diagnoses are clearly there. Her mother suffered from schizophrenia, and her grandmother had bipolar disorder, the psychotic form of that on the spectrum. And so we know that bipolar disorder and schizophrenia kind of aggregate in families. There tends to be an intergenerational connection. And so for Marilyn to have developed the bipolar disorder, that seems very clear. She clearly had episodes of very severe major depression. She wrote about them. They were observed by her husbands and other people who were surrounded by her. And she also had the fluctuation of moods, which were also clear. Some people talked about how she appeared to be so different in the course of just a few days or a few weeks or a few months. And I think they used the word schizophrenia just to kind of differentiate the difference, but it wasn't truly schizophrenia. She didn't have delusions and she didn't have hallucinations, which are a form of schizophrenia, which her mother had. She had mood fluctuations, and it was more of the depression and the mania, and maybe the mixed episode of both of them happening at the same time. And that clearly was intergenerational. That there was a genetic component to that. Among all of this was also addictive disorders that were developing. So she was prescribed barbiturate medications. So it seems clear that she developed an addiction to sedative drugs as well. Back in those days, and even today, people self-medicate these symptoms with drugs and alcohol. And back then, we didn't have effective medications for any of these disorders. So I think you have all of those things going on at once. PTSD, post-traumatic stress, BPD, borderline personality disorder, the bipolar disorder, and some form of an addictive disorder based upon which medications that she was developing the addiction to.
So what happens a lot of times, and we see this, and I want to see if this is just a rumor in the sense that people just think this, that creative people lend themselves to bipolar or borderline personality disorder because they're highly creative and their mind is very fluid, which also then lends itself to some type of addiction behavior, because especially with pills and alcohol, because that's a way of self-medicating, especially if you're bipolar, and we'll talk about that next week, where you have these highs and this grandiose of being able to kind of calm yourself down or calm your mind down. What do you say to the first part of that question, which is, is it more likely to happen in creative people versus non-creative people? And then the second part of it is, are there a lot of people walking around with mental health issues that are really using alcohol and drugs to self-medicate?
Okay, so going back to these types of professions linked to these disorders, I don't think any of the professions cause the disorders. I think what happens is the disorder is present in the person, and people with bipolar disorder are extremely bright, brilliant people who part of their disorder is what gives them their unique talents, the energy and the creativity. Those things go hand in hand. So these folks would be more drawn to the arts and to the performing arts. It would give them the canvas and the channel to be able to do all these wonderful things that they can. And so it's easy to see why the entertainment industry would be so attractive to them. When you think of borderline personality disorder with the identity issues and the need for external validation. So you can see why a career in entertainment where there's an audience to give that validation, we might not be drawn to that type of a career if we have a very solid sense of identity and our needs are met internally. We don't need that from the audience. But especially in Marilyn's case, where she talked about such emptiness in her life and wanting that attention, wanting healthy attention that she didn't have from her early caregivers. The film industry, just provided a way for her to get this en masse from the world, actually. So you can see how that would be conducive.
And then in regards to the self-medicating.
Well, with the bipolar disorder, the depression is the most uncomfortable feeling usually for the person experiencing it. And when they have the surges of mania, people around them might be really concerned. But when you're experiencing that yourself, it's a great feeling and it feels so much better than the depression. And so many people feel that the mania is just actually their normal state. And they don't recognize it as something that could be equally serious. And so the medication that kind of stabilizes the mood, it might not feel as great as when they're on that manic high, because mania provides really a high. And so sometimes there's a resistance to stay on the medication or to take the medication because it just feels so good. And when you've experienced the lows of depression, you really never want to feel that anymore. So you're trying to work really hard to kind of avoid that. So it's just an extra challenge in there. And of course, anyone dealing with any kind of a mental health symptom, anxiety, because 20% of us are struggling with anxiety out in the world. It's very easy to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol. Anxiety, social anxiety, going to parties, feeling confident, talking to folks under that kind of extreme stress. For some of us, it's easier to get a drink. Even to perform on the job or to perform in the entertainment industry, a tendency to maybe, oh, should I take medication to bring me to the level so that I can perform? But then when I'm at that level, I need to go home and get some sleep. Do I need other medications to bring me down? That can set up a very dangerous cycle of addiction with stimulant medications and sedative medications to kind of control energy. So, all of this is kind of a way a person struggles on their own without the necessarily the support of a prescribing professional who can.
And that's what happened that's what happened with Marilyn. She was literally being prescribed all these drugs for so were all the stars back in the day, up and then down.
Yeah, I mean, when these drugs started to develop, they were seen as kind of the modern marvel. You can solve all of your problems with a pill. And certainly in the entertainment industry, they had the resources and the doctor resources and to be able to be, giving this to their performers to get them to perform and work for them. But it came at a detriment, not just to people like Marilyn, but also to people like Judy Garland and others. And many of the other stars were struggling with other forms of mental illness as well, which these medications just exacerbated that as well. We do need to go through all of the rest of the criteria.
Okay, let's finish that because we have a long segment this time. So we'll finish this up. There's so much good stuff in here. So let's finish.
We talked about the distorted or unstable self-image or sense of self. There's impulsive and often dangerous behaviors. And this is also sometimes confusing with bipolar mania. But someone with BPD might go on spending sprees or engage in unsafe sex, substance abuse, reckless driving. But if it's occurring during an elevated mood state, it's probably more about bipolar disorder than borderline personality disorder. And then the self-harming behavior, such as cutting. And we talked about the suicide attempts that are not necessarily intended, but the danger is the person with BPD can go just too far and actually kill themselves, even though that wasn't their original intent. Maybe they just wanted to end the pain. Maybe they wanted someone to come to them who they feared would leave them, or a way to hold on to a relationship that they feared they were losing. Intense and highly changeable moods. That might just be short-term, a few days or a few hours. Chronic feelings of emptiness. And this is an important one because all of us can feel a little empty, but we have a sense of who we are. We have it's kind of an emotional skeleton inside of ourselves that kind of keeps us intact and keeps us together. But someone with BPD feels so empty inside, it almost feels like they don't have that internal ectoskeleton. So they're always trying to fill themselves with something. And no matter how hard they're trying to fill themselves, either through a relationship or through love or whatever, it's almost like there's a hole and everything's pouring right back out. They never feel whole and intact. There's inappropriate, I'm reading some of my cheat sheet notes here to make sure I get through all the criteria. Inappropriate or intense anger or problems controlling anger, which impacts the relationships and makes the relationships as unstable as we talked about before. Difficulty trusting, which sometimes is accompanied by irrational fear of other people's intention, which was that paranoia that we talked about. And sometimes almost a sense of dissociation. We talked about this last week. We're kind of feeling cut off from oneself, or being outside of one's body, or kind of feeling a sense of unreality. And this isn't like multiple personality disorder, which is very, very rare. It's not anything like that. But that sense of being so detached, which Marilyn wrote about extensively in her journals. So, just to underscore that only 5 of the criteria is necessary for the diagnosis. And I think, for most folks, I remember when I was in graduate school and when we were studying many of the symptoms, it's such a easy thing to just want to self-diagnose or see yourself or people you love in some of these symptoms, which is not always accurate. It does take a licensed professional to make the disorder. So we shouldn't jump to conclusions, and we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that, oh, I have BPD or my loved one has BPD. We really need more information before we make that kind of determination.
So Gary, do you think that we can get the criteria and we'll list it and post it on American Icon for people, so then that way they can have it? I know we've been talking about a lot of stuff during this session here on borderline personality disorder. Next week we're going to be talking about bipolar, and we have some questions from a couple of you already that are actually dealing with bipolar disorder. So we'll save those for next week. But also want to just ask you, because it sounds like from what we've heard and what I know of Marilyn as well, she really does fit a lot of the borderline personality, bipolar, extreme anxiety. I mean, she had a lot of trauma, and it fits it, and also with the legacy in terms of intergenerational. So I think the key here is to get diagnosed yourself. If you feel like you have 1 more 5 of those symptoms and you're not quite exactly sure what you have, the key here is to know that you're not alone. And think about Marilyn, how much she achieved in her lifetime with not being properly diagnosed or treated, really. They thought they were treating her. And the reality is that she achieved so much. So just think about what you can achieve, and using, again, her life and legacy for transformation and not tragedy. You don't have to be a tragedy. You don't have to be feeling like you are ashamed. You don't have to live behind the wall. It's time to get help. People are talking about this more and more. And if you have a symptom, it could be just one of the symptoms, check it out. There's nothing to be afraid of.
Every moment matters, and it's never too late.
So in closing, Gary, what thoughts would you like us to know about Marilyn, borderline personality disorder, or possibly somebody getting help themselves?
There's so many thoughts that I have. People who survive trauma and adverse childhood experiences are very resilient, and they really need to honor and acknowledge for themselves the strength that it took to survive. I don't know that I would have survived it. So if you got through it alive, you are a hero. And it's like being a soldier in a war. And that's what Marilyn wrote about. She talked to Dr. Greenson about feeling like a soldier who just kept going back and back into battle and having all of these battle wounds and battle scars. And so, you know something that many of us don't know. You belong to a select few group of people who have been through these experiences and have insights that some of us don't have. But all those things can be used and propelled into a better tomorrow, a better future. But the strength and the courage that it took to survive is something to be honored and celebrated. And so treatment is just another step. And if you can survive the trauma, you can work your way through a treatment program, and you can see the benefit of that. And, sometimes we have to go to treatment for a while, and sometimes it gets to be too much and we want to take a little bit of a break, and sometimes we have to go back. And so however the journey is, it's not about just a destination. It's the journey and just getting yourself there. Every day you're just a step further from where we came from.
All right. On that closing note, as we say, always hold a good thought for Marilyn. this week, we're going to hold a good thought for you. Until next week, myself, Nina Boski, and Mr. Gary Vitacco Robles, thank you. And again, we will talk to you next week, and we'll hold a very good thought for you.
Holding a good thought. Bye.
Bye for now.